Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's get started. Welcome to the May 3rd Thursday Web Forum. My name's Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications for the South Atlantic LCC. And every month we host this Web Forum featuring a presentation on current and ongoing work throughout your cooperative. It happens every third Thursday of the month right here at 10 a.m. And it's intended to serve as a chance for you to ask questions, share feedback that will help guide the future of the South Atlantic LCC. So every month we have roughly the same agenda. I'll start out by introducing our presenter. We'll hear them talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and then afterward we'll have plenty of time for questions and spend the rest of the webinar on updates from LCC staff, followed by an open discussion. Before I hand things off to Rua this morning, a few logistics. As usual, to minimize background noise, I'll mute everyone during the presentation. So if you have questions, either type them directly into the chat box, and I'll monitor that, or just hold them until after the presentation. And if you want to speak at any time, all you have to do is press *6 to unmute yourself. So before I mute everybody, does anyone want to share any questions, comments, or concerns?
The conference is now in silent mode.
Great. So presenting today, we have Rua Mordecai, who is, of course, our very own science coordinator here at the South Atlantic LCC. He's going to be talking about the draft of the latest version of the Blueprint, Blueprint version 2.1, which went out for review last Monday. So Rua, I'm going to pass presenter power over to you to get us started.
Sounds excellent. I will take it.
You have the power.
All right. Okay. Now we're rolling. All right. Can you see my screen?
Sure can.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to dive right into some of the Blueprint updates and a little feedback. This will be pretty fun. So on the agenda, I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the bigger improvements in version 2.1. And then we're going to queue up some questions for you. And so I'll do a quick check on attendees and how many people we have before we do this to see we'll either use the chat box or I might just kind of go one by one for folks on the call. But the big three questions here, any key places that you've noticed that are missing from the current blueprint, places that you think are prioritized too highly, and then also some future blueprint improvements you'd like to see. So essentially, it could be something like I'd like to see this ecosystem or this area improved, or it could be something that the blueprint doesn't do right now that you'd like to see it do. So kind of fairly open on that. And you can pass too, it's okay. So that's what we're going to do. We'll kind of go through that process afterwards. All right, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about some major improvements in Blueprint 2.1, and I'm going to hit on three of the major ones. There's a few more improvements you can read about on the Blueprint 2.1 draft page. It kind of goes over even more detail of the improvements and some issues. Big ones I'm going to focus on: freshwater aquatic, the marine environment, and then on urban areas. And so these are ones we spent a lot of work on because on the Blueprint 2.0 workshops, these were some of the ecosystems that tended to have the biggest problems and the most regular sort of comments from a number of you that were at the workshop. So that's what we worked on improving. So let's start on the freshwater aquatic side. So one key part of some of the improvements in the freshwater aquatic is that we now have GIS layers for active river area across the entire geography, which is very, very exciting. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this active river idea, you're essentially trying to combine all these areas that are most strongly influencing the aquatic system itself. So it's not just the sort of in-channel characteristics, the overall meander belts, but also the floodplains, riparian wetlands, and some of the key uplands that are contributing sediment and pieces like that. So you have a lot of similarities with the Army Corps 100-year floodplain, except for we actually have it across the whole geography seamlessly. So that was very particularly helpful, part of the Southeast Aquatic Connectivity Assessment Project. And so that allows us to essentially snap a lot of the indicators like riparian buffers, shown here on the right, and now apply them to the active river area. So that's actually where that riparian buffer is happening. So that's particularly nice. So the darker blue are riparian buffers that are in better condition, and as you get warmer, now they start getting worse and worse. So you can immediately see some areas you probably know or pick out: eastern North Carolina and all of the sort of heavily diked and impaired areas, and southwest Georgia, a lot of major agricultural impacts over there. So that's particularly exciting on what we can do for our indicators, but it's also great because it helps improve how we integrate the terrestrial and aquatic indicators together in the prioritization. Also had a number of improvements and new indicators in the revision process, so improving the underlying data from the blueprint, which was really great. So got some new changed indicators for migratory fish, a new one for aquatic diversity hotspots, which is particularly important as some of the condition indicators were not capturing in the testing a lot of the sort of key spots for endemism. And we also have network complexity, so looking at number of connected stream classes. This is part of an effort to incorporate more climate change resiliency into some of the aquatic indicators as well. And also made some good improvements on things like riparian buffers and permeable surface, updated information, better methods, that kind of stuff. Oh, here's an example of some of the changes here. So we're going to zoom into the Roanoke tar area of North Carolina. We'll zoom in up to that spot. And so this is Blueprint 2.0. You can immediately see up in the top right, you've got sort of the Roanoke River floodplain. But a lot of these spots and key diversity areas and stuff, especially around the tar and other sections, really weren't coming out of that area. So here's one of our kind of testing data sets. This is Blueprint 2.0 and some of the North Carolina significant heritage areas. And you can see a number of these spots that are particularly important, especially for aquatic diversity. We're not really coming out back and forth in the blueprint. So that was something a lot of you noticed as we were doing the evaluation of Blueprint 2.0 in the workshops. So now here's Blueprint 2.1, and so now we're actually capturing a lot more. Again, not perfect as always, but we're actually capturing a lot more of those priority areas now, especially the ones that came out. Ran through a pretty big list of some good feedback we got from the last version, and a lot of those places are now covered. So that was exciting to see. Again, still some issues, but good improvements. All right, so now on to the urban side of things. So we'll go upstream here up to Kerry, North Carolina to talk about some of the urban improvements. So here's the Kerry area on the west side. You've got the sort of major water supply reservoir and watershed. You can probably see a number of the key sort of parks and green spaces. Well, one of them is a country club in the middle, but a lot of these sort of embedded areas of open space and parks. Now, version 2.0, although we did have this urban open space indicator and a few metrics, didn't do a very good job. So here you've got some kind of historic areas. Umstead State Park as a major area comes out as fairly high priority, but really wasn't kind of capturing the urban areas very well at all. And now here's version 2.1. So you'll notice we're actually capturing a lot more of these areas around the water supply watershed, but also picking out a lot more of these areas that are either already protected for open space or could be future urban open space. So some fairly good improvements. Again, not perfect as usual, but we made a good step on the urban areas now. Now, a lot of that is due to our improved Urban Open Space Index. So now we've snapped it to just areas near within urban areas. So essentially, we've got our sort of urban area definitions based on the census and then a buffer area of how far people are likely to travel outside of that. And the highest value is the existing protected open space. So that's the highest one in the index. But then the next highest brings in more of a sort of equity component and is looking for unprotected and undeveloped land that's near those without good access to open space. So part of the idea of this indicator around the upland hardwoods is its role and its plays in connecting people and nature. And so what this is actually essentially doing is trying to make sure we're connecting as many possible people with nature through that. So here's what it looks like around that same area I was showing you before. So that dark purple are already protected areas, and that basically that sort of blue-green area, now we're capturing places that have enough undeveloped land that you could have maybe some new parks and green space, but the folks that live there don't already have good access to existing green space. You can also see where the base map is bleeding through at the bottom. Right now, our we kind of have this hard boundary between urban and non-urban. In future updates, we hope to make that more of sort of a blended gradient instead of just kind of a hard line, because that's more like how it is. So that shows you some of the urban open space. We've got an ongoing project with the American Planning Association, so expect to see some even bigger improvements in some of this index and maybe some other metrics over the next year or two. Now, on to the marine. Some of the big marine improvements are based on some new marine mammal models that just came out of Duke fairly recently. We've been working closely with the Duke folks on this. So this is pulling out a ton of observational data, and fusing it with oceanographic data, doing some modeling, incorporating detectability, see things like distance sampling, and then developing monthly spatial models for density of marine mammals in the area. So this is particularly exciting, really helps us improve how we're capturing these important productivity hotspots in the marine areas. And it also opens up a chance to do some new methods for incorporating time and uncertainty. So Zonation, the program we do for running the blueprint, this is a good chance to now start incorporating some of the new methods we haven't been able to try yet. So in the marine environment, especially around the marine mammals, we're actually including each month for each species as a separate input, and essentially what the program is doing is trying to make sure you have high-quality representations for all of the species for all of the different months. So we account now for these kind of choke points in life history where a certain species may be only confined to a small area during a certain month. So that's very cool. We're also using the spatial uncertainty estimates, and something called information gap decision theory to find robust prioritization. So yeah, we know those models are a little bit off; they're not perfect. And so across some of that range of uncertainty, we're also using that as well in the prioritization. And the cool thing about this is not just for the marine environment, which is a fairly dynamic system, but it also opens up some new approaches for dealing with these sort of time-ordered decisions under future change. So this opens up some new methods for, things like looking at restoration of longleaf and wetland migration corridors and making sure that you have enough of that ecosystem over time at each time step. So this is kind of a small step into some very cool methods that we might be able to use in the future. Here's what the marine mammals part looks like. So this is 14 mammal species, basically dolphins and whales, 11 of which we have monthly layers, and blue is the higher priority. And so this is big improvements in particularly nearshore marine priorities, which we had almost none in Blueprint 2.0. So that's big improvement. And another really nice thing is we're working on consistency with some marine spatial planning efforts in the Mid-Atlantic and the North Atlantic. And also when we run this stuff, we're incorporating the full Atlantic. So we account for things like that certain species may have kind of fairly large or important components during a given month outside of the South Atlantic LCC, either farther south or up farther north. So these models run all the way up into Canada. So we've got the full Atlantic. So yay. One thing that you don't see in the current draft is the draft corridors. So one of the things we noticed as we were getting close to releasing the draft is that there were some issues with particular key hubs in the geography, and corridors are very sensitive to which hub are selected. Of course, you're making a corridor from one place to another. So we noticed a few key hubs that were missing from a previous draft, not the one you saw. The one that's released is actually, that issue's fixed, but it takes a while to run the corridors. And so we should have the draft corridors for Blueprint 2.1 out, maybe Friday or likely around Monday or Tuesday. So that's a couple of weeks off. We noticed that issue, and we didn't want you to spend time reviewing corridors if they were going to change once we fix that issue. So those should be coming out fairly soon. And one quick shout out to some major known issues already. One, the eastern part of the right whale calving ground, so in the marine area, is under-prioritized. We're working, that's partly basically due to some of the right whale models and how they depict right whales. So folks at Duke are working on that issue right now. Piedmont prairie areas, we just still don't have a really good layer of condition and where these areas are. So those areas tend to be under-prioritized. Some aquatic areas are over-prioritized. Our aquatic diversity hotspots is at a HUC 12 level, and as a lot of y'all know, some of those hotspots don't really cover the entire HUC 12 watershed. And then also notice that the urban open space is poorly captured in some metropolitan areas in Georgia and South Carolina because those protected areas are missing from the secured lands database, or basically our protected areas layer. So that's going to get fixed in the next update, talking to folks down at Georgia TNC. So that'll get fixed in the next update, but likely won't be ready in time for 2.1, but for future revisions. So here is Blueprint 2.1. Again, that's sort of the darker blue is the highest priority. So I just wanted to give you a quick comparison, 2.1 versus 2.0 in that transition. So here's 2.1, here's 2.0, here's 2.1 again. So a couple of things you'll immediately notice. We've really improved the marine environment. So here's the older version, almost no priorities on the coast. We still hit the shelf break, but major problems with that. That was kind of a known issue. 2.1 has tested a lot better. Still room for improvement, but much better. You also notice a lot of the key no-brainer hubs and places you would think about, the Altamaha, Okefenokee, sections of sort of like the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula, down the Big Bend of Florida, are still coming out in this version of the blueprint. So, and also you'll notice a lot more kind of incorporation of some of these key aquatic areas, especially in the Piedmont, where more of the prioritization moves to some of these key aquatic areas. So that is the transitions between these two. All right, so before we move on to some questions for you, I just want to see if there are any questions from the group about what I just went over in the updates. And so you can either hit *6 to unmute your phone, or I think you can put your question in the chat box as well.
We have a question from the chat box, Rua.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe a bit more how you defined access to open space and the urban open space indicator?
Yeah, so we use a meta-analysis of one of the bands we used, looked at the impact of distance to open space on property values, and these work fairly well with the different classes, and so there are different distance bands of how far what's an easy walk, what's a harder walk, what's a sort of a bike distance. So we pulled that a lot from the literature and into different bands. So I can show you how to find that on the metadata as well. And luckily, there's actually been a lot of studies on property values in the South Atlantic and how far people are likely to travel. So I'll show you where those come from actually in a second here. Actually, so while I'm doing that, do we have, while I'm looking that up, so I'm going to share your screen, and I'll even show you how to do that, to find this information, and make sure it's up there on the Planning Atlas. So while I'm looking for that, so here we are in the Conservation Planning Atlas. So we can go to draft 2.1 data. And we're still working, most of the metadata is already up here. So we'll go to Indicators 2.1. There may be a gap, so I'm flying without a net here. We go into Upland Hardwoods, so now we're in the Indicators. Upland Hardwoods, Urban Open Space, Indicator version 2.1. So here is the map. Here's the indicator itself. You can download the data. If you click here on the bottom right, you have the full metadata that will also come with you eventually as you download it. So we have the input data, mapping steps, and so here in the mapping steps, we've got the components here of the distance bands, so sort of less than 400 meters, 400 to 800, 800 to 1600 meters, and then also down here, here's the citations for the distances and where we got the different bands is below.
Great, thanks. Any other questions, folks, before we move on?
I have one. This is Neil Burns in EPA Region 4.
Oh, hey, Neil. Perfect. I was about to email you for a more detailed sit-down, so good time.
Yeah, so good. Look forward to that. And forgive me if my question is too basic, but I know when you were talking about the marine, the updates to marine habitats and stuff. Did you include sea turtles with that, or was it just marine mammals?
We did. So actually, I don't have time to pull this up. So our intent was to do marine mammals and sea turtles. From Blueprint 2.0, the data set we had to use had so many no data and giant gaps in it that it was really problematic. And the sea turtle, there are seabird and sea turtle models that are very, very close to ready, but they weren't quite ready yet. And so what we essentially did is then tested some of the sea turtle survey information against the marine mammal indicator, and it actually works really well, and the marine mammal priorities capture the sea turtle, in-water sea turtles very well, with the exception of that one known issue where there's a spot during the spring in the eastern part of the right whale grounds that's also important for sea turtles. But for every other season, these highest priority areas in the blueprint, these kind of darkest areas, are also your highest densities of sea turtles as well. So we hope to bring sea turtles and then seabirds into this analysis. They're not quite ready yet.
Yeah, I thought it might just help with the prioritization.
Yeah. I was bummed that wasn't going to be ready in time because I think that's going to be another improvement in some of the nuances and details.
And I have one final basic question. Did you make a distinction between marine and coastal, or like the salt marshes and all the biodiversity and productivity that's associated with that? Is that included? Or?
Yes, they're in different ecosystems. So the ecosystems we have right now, so as you're moving out, so we've got our sort of freshwater marshes, and then the Estrin ecosystem captures the open water estuaries and I'll pull this out here, that captures the open water estuaries and the salt marshes, and that has its own suite of indicators. So we'll go in here to Estrin. So here's Estrin. It's the sort of coastal condition index, wetland patch size, water vegetation edge. So those are what's driving in the Estrin component, and then in the marine environment then sort of works out from there. So that's a separate ecosystem with its prioritization.
Thank you.
Those are very good questions. So I was skipping a lot of stuff. Make sure we had time to move forward. All right. Any other questions for the group?
We have one more from the chat box.
Yeah.
Another quick question about urban open space, a question about how we define urban areas. Is it based on the size of the city or the population? My recollection was it was census-designated urban areas, but...
Yeah, so we buffer, so what's nice is that the U.S. Census Bureau has I can't even pull it up. So the U.S. Census Bureau has a formal definition of what areas are quote-unquote urban. And so we used that and then buffered it using those distances I mentioned before, and this will actually give you a quick visual. There's a few other, sort of definitions that are more census block pieces, but they are based on, I think, population density. So this will show you, this is the census block area, then buffered. So all of these sections in the center are considered urban up in the Piedmont. And then this is a sort of a buffer. One of the things we noticed, the reason we didn't snap it to just the census, U.S. Census definition of what's an urban area, is that you'd often, if you're at the edge of that urban area, often there'd be, a big park or an area of open space that's, fairly close to you, kind of an easy bike ride that, wouldn't get captured in this. So, yeah, that seemed to work the best as a definition for urban.
Great. Anybody else?
All right, excellent. Actually, while I'm sharing this, just one quick heads up. I went for the high level, but here we are at the web page. If we go to Conservation Blueprint and review draft 2.1, there's a little more details, a little more of the major improvements incorporated in here, including some stuff in the Estrin ecosystem and also some other even more known issues that I mentioned before, in addition to a place to provide feedback on these. All right, so now what we're going to do next here is we're going to get up some questions for you. So I mentioned before, key places missing, places prioritized too highly, and then future improvements. But what I'm going to do real quick, I'm going to do a fairly quick look at the participants, and I have a fairly simple rule to decide whether we are going to yep, and we've exceeded that rule. Yeah, so instead of going person by person, we're going to do something a little different approach. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this through the chat box. And so in the top right of your screen, there should be a little picture that shows, kind of says chat and has a little bubble over it. In case you haven't already opened that, that will open up the chat box. And what we're going to do is we're going to go question by question. So let me see if I can open up my chat box here. Yes, I have a chat box. So in the chat box, it will look a little different for you since you're not sharing your screen. And so just go ahead, and in that chat box, we're going to start by this key places missing question. And right above the places you're going to type, there's a little send to, and there should be an option at the very top to send to everyone. So just go ahead and select everyone. Otherwise, it'll just go to, I think, Hillary being the host, and your secret comments, and no one else will get to see them. So Louise is already getting started. See, look how easy it is to type in comments. So let's start from that first question, key places missing. So if there are some key places that you see are missing, go ahead and pull down the send to everyone and just go ahead and type it and hit send. And I can put the Blueprint 2 map back up. 0.1 map up. And you can also, oops, come on now. There we go. And feel free, if you want to pull up the blueprint itself up on the draft version, we can do that. I can show you how to do that real quick if you don't know how to kind of open it up in the Planning Atlas and view it in more detail. Okay, so give y'all a second. Okay, so quickest way to pull this up in database and on the stuff. So Duncan, are you in? Let's see. I will show you the quickest way to do this from the Planning Atlas. So here we are. I'll give you two options. So here you are if you're in the blueprint. If you go from the blueprint page, review draft blueprint 2.1, and then right at the top here under review, go to the Conservation Planning Atlas to view draft 2.1. And there's right there, that map, draft 2.1 is here. If you are coming from the Conservation Planning Atlas, so here we are in the front, at the bottom left, draft blueprint 2.1 data. And then at the very top here, there is, right here, this map says draft blueprint 2.1. So you can click on that, open it up in a map. And so this will then, that'll load the blueprint. And if you need to, so you've got a legend up in the top here, highest priority, high priority, medium. It's going to be in your top right. And so then as you zoom in, if you want to go figure out what pixels, kind of a reminder, instead of the colors, you got this little identify button, which will pull up one record, highest priority for shared action. It'll actually give you the priority level below just highest and high. It'll give you the percentile as well.
So we do have a question from Gail asking about, is there a way to find out why a pixel is highest, high, or medium? And I thought it was worth kind of addressing that on the phone to everyone. This is something that we're going to be adding to the Simple Viewer very soon, but it's not something that you can really do in the Planning Atlas. The easiest thing to do is just get a sense of what ecosystem you think you're in, and you can overlay the indicators from that ecosystem and sort of judge visually with the overlap what indicators are scoring exceptionally high, and that's likely what's driving the prioritization. Would you add anything to that, Rua?
Yeah, I think right now, I mean, you can overlay the indicators and it will tell you a little bit about some of the places, but that's one of the things we're working on for the next update of the interface that gives you a little bit more of a fuller idea of why certain areas end up higher priority than others within the ecosystem. So that's a key thing we've been working on a lot, which is kind of the unpacking of the priority layers. It's very doable. It's just a matter of making it a little easier when you have so many ecosystems and indicators together.
So stay tuned. We should be able to make that a lot easier for you by July or August when we do the update of the Simple Viewer to version 2.1.
Yep.
And we also have a question from, or maybe more of an observation, that we didn't run coastal resource models for the Big Bend. I'm interpreting that to mean looking at the Gulf, the marine environment in the Gulf. Did you want to touch on that, Rua?
Yeah, and actually that's a good one to pull up. I'll zoom out because I was looking at that. Curious to see what we would get in the review there, because one of the things you've noticed, I was looking at some of the parts of the coast of the Gulf. So to answer maybe two questions. One, for the marine environment, so the offshore beyond the sort of salt marshes, we do not. Basically, we're trying to work across all the different LCCs and across the Gulf of Mexico for the marine component out beyond the shore. Because we have such a small little slice of the Gulf, we're trying to work on the prioritization kind of at a broader Gulf level. So that's why you see the full Atlantic marine systems, but then once you get off the coast, we did not run models. You don't have the marine ecosystem because the Gulf is a little bit different in that section, and so we're trying to work with some of the other spatial planning efforts in the Gulf to fill in that particular gap. So that is the plan, and yeah, and actually that is fairly interesting. I think I noticed, John, you're mentioning some of the sort of coastal Big Bend issues. This is actually one of the areas we were looking at in the coast. A lot of the places you might expect farther up the Big Bend of Florida are coming out, but a few of the marshes drop down in prioritization a little bit, particularly due to some of the smaller patch sizes compared to some of the other ecosystems, and also due to some poorer scores in coastal condition in the most recent 2010 update. So now with the Coastal Condition Index, we brought in both 2006 and 2010 data. So that's before kind of all the areas were kind of higher priority, and some of the more recent coastal condition has kind of knocked down those a little bit. But that's an excellent point, and one I was curious to see if anyone else would pick up on in some of this coastal area. So that's noted. What's going to happen, by the way, for folks as some of these comments come in is that we'll try to address them within, before Blueprint 2.1 is officially sort of finished. And if we can't do it by then, it'll become a known issue in the metadata and the documentation, and then something we work on for the next Blueprint update, which will likely be, within a year or so. All right.
Yeah, we have a comment from John on coastal Big Bend as well, so looks like that's coming out a couple of times.
Yeah.
Anyone else have anything to type into the chat box for this question?
Any other thoughts on things that you feel are missing, kind of that jump out at you? Oops, let me get resuming.
It definitely helps to have this written down as a record for us to refer back to, so thanks for taking the time to type it out for us.
Mm-hmm.
Might it be worth spending a little time to talk about what we mean by shared action? Priority for shared action.
Yeah, and so in this case, the approach of the blueprint is kind of a portfolio-based approach. So this idea, and it kind of fits with this idea of mutually reinforcing actions, that everyone kind of takes their own piece of the blueprint that might fit best with them. So this idea of shared action is, here are the places in a broader sort of portfolio of places to take shared actions, and we have some of the different actions, the full suite from protection to incentives to education, outreach, and those various components. But basically, the idea is that these are the highest priorities for collectively improving the ecosystems itself. So that's the idea of sort of it's shared action. In some cases, there are going to be multiple organizations where these where the benefits overlap, and in some cases, there are going to be other organizations that might work together. Hopefully that addressed.
Yeah, that's great. Pam's pointing out very helpfully that we should probably add a more full discussion of that to the metadata so that folks can get a better sense of what we mean by that. Yeah. So I've made a note of that.
Excellent.
Some other questions popping up in the chat. I don't know how much time we want to spend on answering particular questions. Rick, I wanted to speak to your point very briefly about connectivity across the boundary with the Appalachian LCC. Because Blueprint 2.1, this draft that we're looking at, isn't showing the corridors yet, that's going to be something that's going to be fleshed out a lot more completely in the final draft of Blueprint 2.1. And at least what we did with the connectivity analysis in 2.0, Rua might correct me if this is being changed for the transition to 2.1, but we used hubs that are actually across beyond the South Atlantic LCC's boundary so that we create corridors that span the boundary and actually push over into the Appalachian LCC. So if you looked at the blueprint on its own, it might look like a corridor almost to nowhere, but if you look beyond the boundary, look at kind of protected lands across the boundary, you'd see, oh yeah, this is pushing across maybe into Pisgah, maybe into Chattahoochee. So we're definitely considering connectivity as something that spans the boundary and doesn't just stop at the South Atlantic.
Yep, that's pretty much how it works, and it's as far out as a major black bear dispersal event because black bears will go in all directions. The cooperative, and so we have hubs that go into the Appalachians, the Gulf Coast, the Plains and Ozarks, down into Florida, and this is actually an interesting feature of kind of how our conservation estate has been built. Whereas you go up into the mountains, you have tons of protection and things in like really great condition, and you start seeing some of this at the edges and little monadnocks along the edge of the LCC. But yeah, I mean, condition-wise, it is right along that line and then in. But the corridors, like Hillary said, same methods as before. We look from a connectivity perspective on all of those. And then I also sit on the technical, committees for the blueprint equivalent in the Appalachian, on the aquatic and terrestrial as well. So we've been trying to seam up our indicators and comparing layers across all the different boundaries to make sure things line up. I also didn't mention it. This is actually an improvement on the sort of peninsular Florida clip. This version matches better with Florida clip than the previous version in a number of different places. Let's see. What else? What other questions do we have here that I'm missing? Oh, estuarine waters. So one of the things on the estuarine ecosystems that's a little different than before. So each of these ecosystems, we're prioritizing these priority classes are percentages of the ecosystem. So what you're seeing in the blueprint is, that darkest class is the top 10% within each ecosystem, and then the high priority is the next 30%. Medium is sort of capturing the rest up to 50%. And so this is the question of sort of why more the estuarine, so the open waters. So what you're seeing is that is the top 10% according to the indicators and the top 30% of the indicators. And so that's why within each ecosystem you're seeing that not all the estuarine waters are high priority. So that's in the current version. We ran into this with Blueprint 1 where, it's like, okay, the entire, all the beaches are highest priority. Well, that doesn't really help you if you're trying to help prioritize efforts within beaches. If everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So that's why you see the estuaries, and that's the same for all these ecosystems. That's the top 10, 30, and 50 of the marine, of the upland hardwoods, and of all those other systems. So I'm thinking right now, instead of asking, I know we're going to get a few more questions here, what we're going to do is kind of capture some of these, and we may come back to them if we have time, or otherwise what I will do is I will chase down, like I noticed, Duncan, you've got one on the Aquacme. questions. So we're gonna kind of capture those and look a little bit closer and kind of provide you some feedback on okay, what's going on, and then why, kind of what we might do to resolve it. Either it becomes a known issue or some improvements we might be able to make. So I'll capture that there. So give you all a second if you have any other key places you think are missing that you'd like your staff here at the cooperative to chase down. Then feel free to I'll give you a second to type that in the chat box, and then we will move on to the next question.
And always remember, too, that this review period, the comments are most helpful by June 1st, so you can always go into the Blueprint 2.0 review page and provide feedback outside this web forum. That door is totally open. So if something comes to you in the middle of the night tomorrow and you go, ooh, I said that, you still have the opportunity.
You betcha. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the second question coming up here, which is, are there some places you think are prioritized too highly? Are you sort of looking at that and saying, wait a minute, I think I'm looking at that place and I feel like this place or this issue is getting prioritized too highly. So we'll go ahead and give you all a second for thoughts on places that you feel like are a little too highly prioritized. The reverse. I'll give you a minute or so to think about it, take a look. While you're thinking, I'll go ahead and answer. I think maybe Ian's question about the emphasis on terrestrial species. They're actually, even though the biggest updates, I focused a lot on the marine and the aquatic side, but in general, the indicators for each of the terrestrial ecosystems include a number of different, either species directly, birds, amphibians, and reptiles as indicators or key features for those things, including even some components that are there to capture rare plant communities and other components. So the wetter indicators and ecosystems had the most problems, and so that's why they're coming up so much in this particular call. So don't want to have the impression that this is just freshwater and marine blueprint, but it is sort of terrestrial, freshwater, marine, full integration.
We have a question from Liz Cayley that's really good. I think it might be worth spending a little time addressing that. Just talking about how we prioritize areas that are already protected versus areas that are unprotected. Does that play into the equation? And she points out that from one perspective, if it's already protected, maybe it should actually be lower priority since it's protected. We were just talking about that in your office yesterday, Rua, the question of management and restoration versus protection. And on the one hand, if it's protected, it's already been conserved in the conservation estate. On the other hand, you can't manage what you don't own. So I'll let you speak to that for a second.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It gets closer down to moving most of the, moving towards conservation actions. The key thing, and what I've seen a lot in some of these layers, and the nice thing about the blueprint actually going and having this sort of larger coverage is, if you want to use the blueprint and you're thinking about kind of land-water protection, well, then you can already pull out the stuff that's already protected, right? And then you're going to your next level, and that's particularly, I'm thinking about some of the ways, what's one of our indicators, the sort of TNC resilience metrics, and I've seen used by Open Space and other organizations, where it's like, okay, here's the part of the state we already have protected. Okay, if we're thinking about protection, what's already not well covered within these ecosystems? And then, you're not really going to be considering already protected areas. I think it's a really good question, and I think that fits to sort of how we might want to think about priority into the future, or another layer that's broken out for sort of, here are the areas that already that may be more sort of restoration and manage on protected areas, and then outside of them.
So Liz, kind of the short answer to your question is that the priorities that you're looking at in the blueprint are based on the indicator condition, and so at a broad sense, protectedness is not baked in to the blueprint, and there's going to be a slight change to that, actually, with the way that we've altered the hubs for the corridor analysis in 2.1, so that if you are a really large protected area and you're not coming up as a hub just based on indicator conditions, those are going to be burned into the medium priority category. But other than that, what you're seeing is a prioritization based on just the current condition of the indicators, so nothing's getting more or less emphasis because it's protected. It's kind of outside of protected status entirely.
Yeah, right now there's no protected status going into this. This is all sort of indicators of condition, and trying to maintain that balance of, you could be a key part of the network, but still be sort of a private land, a big patch of private lands. So wanted to make sure there was that sort of balance of sort of protected areas, but also key working lands. So yeah, in fact, this version doesn't use protected status at all in the prioritization. And then I think Rick had a question about the heavy prioritization within the Piedmont versus the plains north of Carolinas. Rick, do you want to maybe hit *6 and explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is Rick. I've actually got 10 people in the room, and that came from Matt, so I'm going to let Matt both explain his question. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Hey, Rua, sorry about that. That was more of a fat finger on my part. The question was, from what we're looking at here, and it might just be the projection, it looks like the Piedmont has a lot more prioritization spots, or a higher prioritization than, say, the Carolinas. It looks like once you drop below that elevation on the Piedmont, you have a lot of open area that's just not getting anything. Is that due to the land use, or is this an artifact from something that we were looking at?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. There's definitely some conditional different. I mean, you can see the urban megaregion in this very clearly, especially as things diffuse into the more into the rivers and streams. So you can just looking at this, you can see where Atlanta is, and where Raleigh-Durham and Charlotte and those places. It's also partly, some of it is almost like an optical illusion in some ways, because you have in those sections of the Piedmont, the priority is spread out over a lot of different, very smaller kind of pixels around rivers and streams, versus some other areas that are chunks. So it's a little harder to do the percentages, but within each of the ecosystems, so within the Piedmont, the sort of upland hardwoods, that major ecosystem, for the whole Piedmont is all sort of balanced within it, and the coastal plain, which is dominated by the sort of your pine and prairie ecosystem, is balanced. So there's not more or less in, say, upland hardwoods than in open pine, sort of Piedmont versus coastal plain. But there are certainly those dynamics as you get down into Florida, or especially down into Georgia, where actually the ecosystems, especially in the Piedmont, are actually in better condition. They're a little less disturbed. So it's kind of a mix of all those things, I would say. I don't know how much the projection plays into it, but it certainly is a combination. What you get, why they end up kind of close, is as you move closer, that area, the Piedmont, actually has a lot of really high diversity hotspots on the aquatic side that help balance it out a little bit more, even though the overall landscape is in a little bit better condition in some of those areas of kind of northeast Georgia.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. So let's see here. And again, as we're updating the simple viewer and especially the subwatershed viewer, and we do have it right now where you can kind of click on a little subwatershed and it will plot out all the indicators and show whether they're above average for the region and ecosystem, and you can kind of explore those. But this next version, we're also going to have some descriptions about what indicators are really sort of driving and why is this place, why are the priorities in this particular place coming out. And so that we're hoping to have that up by July with new Blueprint 2.1. All right, so I'm seeing things calm down in the chat box. So the last thing I wanted to do here, which is our sort of last question, is this sort of future blueprint improvements you'd like to see. So we're talking a little bit about it. We looked at some known issues, some challenges. So now that the question to all of you in the chat box is, okay, well, we updated 2.1. We've got some capacity and options for continuing to improve the blueprint. What would you like to see next? What kind of improvements would you like to see? So throwing that open to the chat box for ideas and suggestions. Starting to get some excellent suggestions here and some excellent questions. Yep. And so yeah, for Jim on the marine model, we do have the sort of hard bottom that's getting some of the deep water corals. That layer certainly, I was just talking with going later to the SECORA, Southeast Coast and Ocean Observing Regional Association meeting where I've been the last 2 days. And so we're actually working on improving some of the hard bottom. So we have the deep water coral, don't have some of the deep sea vents, and working with the council and actually an ongoing project to bring in some of the breeding aggregation sites and some of the fisheries pieces, trying to improve that depiction. So once that's ready, that's something we're trying to bring in. That I think the fish especially is something we're getting. I'm hoping we can make some good improvement over the next year or so.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question to Cynthia what you mean by HD? I'm assuming you don't mean high def.
Is that human dimensions?
Human dimensions. Excellent. Just making sure I could translate that. Thank you. These are great suggestions. Yeah, I'll keep them coming, and thanks for sending them to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very excellent.
Ooh, Rick, that's a great suggestion. We're actually starting to move that direction with some modeling that links on-the-ground conservation actions to the indicators, and so we're exploring being able to quantify the actual impact of land acquisition on the indicators, so sort of an avoided loss issue, and we're also looking at the impact of prescribed burning on the pine and prairie indicators. That's actually a huge part of demonstrating the return on investment for this success story that we've had, bringing almost $2 million, I guess about $1.5 million to the South Atlantic to support prescribed burning and longleaf pine ecosystems from the Department of Interior's Wildland Fire Resilient Landscapes project. So that's
also on the same front on the marine environment through some sort of ecosystem and ecospace models on the marine side for sort of impact of investments and actions on marine ecosystems as well, and how that fits into even some of the sort of stock assessments and other components of some of fishery planning. So, yeah, this is good. So what's nice is that even if there's something going on, this feedback is really helpful on capturing, I would say, giving certain things additional pushes. It's like, okay, what are we going to accelerate over the next 6 months to a year? Okay, we got a lot of feedback on this particular issue from Blueprint 2.1 review, then that gets higher priority for moving forward. So,
yeah.
Awesome. Very good suggestions.
Well, in our last 2 minutes, I'd love to spend a little time highlighting next month's web forum. We have so many great questions about urban environment that I think folks might be very, very interested in that talk.
Yeah, do it. I was just about to say.
Sweet.
Hillary?
All right. Well, let me reclaim the presenter ball here, if I can find my participants list. It's gotten buried under other windows here. All right. So let me share my slides again, and keep those comments coming, y'all. If you still have stuff in it's bouncing around your brain, you're welcome to keep typing. So we do have the summer web forum schedule available for the next 3 months, just to give you a sense of what's coming. Next month we're going to have a talk about urbanization modeling, and I'll go into a more detailed description of that in a sec. And then in July and August, Rua is going to be giving us updates on some of the outcomes of our steering committee meeting, and we'll have another session of open discussion on where you think the LCC should go next, more broadly. And then in August, we'll be diving into improvements to the simple viewer. You can kind of see what's ready now, and then the next steps that will be taken to improve your ability to explore Blueprint 2.1 in the simple viewer. And so next month, that'll be June 16th, same time, same place, right here at 10 a.m. We'll be hearing from Dr. Derek von Berkel with the NC State's Center for Geospatial Analysis. So he's going to be talking about a new open source model for simulating urbanization and landscape fragmentation. It's called Futures, and it's based on the demand for the development, local site suitability factors, and this patch growing algorithm. So he's going to demonstrate how to use the model, highlight how it's being implemented. And then what I'm really excited about is he's going to dive into some specific results for the South Atlantic LCC region, where they've run some models that compare alternative urban growth scenarios, and particularly the impact of policy restrictions within South Atlantic Blueprint priority areas. So that's going to be a great tool to explore different possible futures and weigh trade-offs associated with urban development, ecosystem services, and kind of answer that question, all right, so we implement the blueprint, maybe we focus smart growth solutions in blueprint areas. What would that mean for the landscape of conservation in our region?
And Duncan wins for the model-based pun of wanting to see the futures talk today.
10 points. Well done, sir. A gold star to you. This is a pun-friendly environment. So that's really all I had. As usual, join the LCC web community, get on the newsletter. You'll get the reminder about this web forum. And if you have other thoughts that come to you about any of these questions we explored about Blueprint 2.1 today, or you want to share other thoughts, please go to that Blueprint 2.1 review page. You can always reach out to somebody on staff and set up a time to talk.
Yep, so the offer is definitely open if y'all want to sit down in more detail and provide some feedback or talk about some of these layers or ask some more questions. Feel free to let me know, and I could set up a WebEx and we can chat. Just, even with a few people, it ends up being pretty valuable. So
thank you guys so much for showing up to share your feedback today, and hope that we'll see you next month.